The teacher accused her of cheating, but the truth shocked everyone. She had done everything right, studied for weeks, skipped weekends out, solved hundreds of practice problems until her fingers ached. And now, standing in front of the entire class with her test paper in hand, Lena, when a Vietnamese-American girl with straight A's and a quiet confidence, was being told, out loud, that there was no way the grade was hers. "This is a joke, right?" Mr. Reynolds said, holding her test up like a piece of forged evidence. "There's just no way a kid like you scored higher than the mayor's son." Silence dropped like a curtain. A few students exchanged looks. Some smiled uncomfortably. Others didn't even bother to hide their amusement. Lena stared at her paper. 100%. Clear, undeniable. But here it was, being questioned not because of error, but because of who she was. Before we go deeper into today's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. Your support means everything to us, and we bring you stories that challenge what you think you know. Now let's get into it. The clock on the classroom wall ticked loudly in Lena's ears as the room stayed still, watching. Mr. Reynolds' words lingered like smoke. "There's just no way a kid like you." She felt her stomach twist. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her desk. No one said a word. Not even Logan Evans, the kid who always had something slick to add. Not even Melissa Harper, who usually played the peacemaker. It was as if the whole class silently agreed. Lena, the girl who sat in the second row, barely spoke unless called on, and came from a neighborhood no one wanted to visit after dark, didn't deserve that 100%. Mr. Reynolds wasn't even hiding it anymore. "You expect me to believe that you, someone who's never placed in the top 3, suddenly aced the most advanced test in my curriculum?" he said, voice rising with theatrical disbelief. "That you beat Logan, whose father funds the district math program, Melissa, whose mom's on the board." He dropped her test on his desk with a sharp slap. "I'm not buying it. There's only one way this happened." She couldn't speak. Her throat felt tight. Not because she was guilty, but because she wasn't. Because she knew exactly how much effort she had put into preparing for that test. How many hours she had spent replaying Khan Academy lectures until her eyes burned. How she'd gone to the public library while her Wi-Fi was down, just to keep studying. But none of that mattered. Her success didn't fit the image people had of her. Not in this school. Not in this town. And then came the sentence. The one that made everything else stop cold. "Let's be real," Mr. Reynolds muttered under his breath. "Not quite enough. There's no way a girl like you is smarter than the mayor's kid." Gasps. A chuckle. Then nothing. Lena looked at him. Really looked. This wasn't about a test. This was about status. About names. About who gets to be seen as intelligent and who gets labeled a fraud the moment they stand out. And in that moment, she realized something. She had the grade. She had the truth. And if they were going to try and erase it, she was going to make damn sure they had to look her in the eye when they did. And that's how it started. Not with a fight. Not with proof. But with disbelief. And a name that suddenly became very hard for everyone to ignore. Lena sat frozen as Mr. Reynolds dragged the whiteboard closer to the front of the class. He wrote out one of the hardest problems from the test, one that required multi-step calculus and the kind of precision you only got from hours of practice. Then, without even looking at her, he slapped the marker down on her desk and said, "If you really solved this, do it again. Right now." The class was silent. A few students exchanged glances. A low chuckle came from the back. "Logan, probably." Melissa looked down at her desk. Lena's hands were sweating. She knew how to do it. She had solved it before. But being forced to redo it in front of everyone felt less like an academic request and more like a public execution. She stood up anyway, walked to the board slowly, picked up the marker. Her hand trembled slightly as she began to work through the problem. She could feel eyes on her back, some skeptical, others curious, a few maybe even hoping she'd fail. She didn't. Line by line, she wrote out each step, each calculation, until the final answer appeared exactly as it had on the test. She capped the marker and stepped back. Silence again. Reynolds stared at the board. No reaction. "Anyone can memorize steps," he muttered. "That doesn't prove anything." Lena turned to face him. "Would you have asked Logan to do this if he'd gotten 100? Her voice was quiet but firm. Reynolds blinked. "Excuse me. If I were white, would you have dragged me to the front of the class and made me prove myself like this?" That got the class buzzing. Whispers spread like fire. Reynolds' face tightened. "Watch your tone." Lena didn't flinch. Watch your bias. The tension in the room was thick. Logan crossed his arms and leaned back with a smug smile. But even he looked a little uncomfortable now. Melissa raised her hand slightly, then lowered it again. No one else spoke. No one defended her. No one defended Reynolds either. He walked to his desk, grabbed her test paper with a sharp flick of his wrist, and stared at it like it offended him. Then, in one sudden motion, he tore it in half. "This is invalid," he said coldly. "You're going to the principal's office." Lena's breath caught in her throat. He had actually done it. In front of the whole class. Her work. Her score. Gone in a heartbeat because someone couldn't accept that she was capable. She stood still for a second. Long enough to register the look on some of her classmates' faces. Shock. Disgust. A few nodded like they knew this was coming. But now they were seeing it unfiltered, unexplainable. Reynolds pointed to the door. "Go." Lena didn't move. "Not yet. You can try to erase my score," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "But it won't change the truth." Then she turned and walked out. And for the first time, the only sound behind her was the squeak of her shoes against the tile. Not laughter. Not whispers. Just a silence that said they all knew something had just broken, and maybe it wasn't her. Lena sat stiffly in the chair across from Principal Michael Torres, her eyes fixed on the floor as she clutched her backpack tightly in her lap. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence sit for a moment, long enough to make sure she was calm enough to hear him. "I want to show you something," he finally said. He turned the laptop on his desk toward her. Next to him, Ms. Harper, the school's guidance counselor, stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. On the screen was a paused frame from the classroom security camera. Torres clicked play. The footage showed Mr. Reynolds alone in the classroom early that morning, before any students had arrived. He was flipping through the stack of graded tests with his coffee in one hand. When he reached Lena's, his hand froze. He stared at it for several seconds, then set his coffee down and leaned closer. His mouth moved, mumbling something to himself, and then, without warning, he slammed the paper down, hard. He looked around the empty room, visibly agitated. Then he took out his phone, typed something, and muttered under his breath. "No way in hell she's that smart." Torres hit pause. Lena blinked. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't say anything. Miss Harper spoke softly. "We reviewed several days of footage. This isn't the first time he's reacted this way to your work." Torres nodded. What happened today wasn't a snap judgment. It was part of a pattern. The principal leaned back in his chair, then exhaled. "You're not in trouble, Lena. But Mr. Reynolds is." Right then, the office door burst open. Reynolds stormed in, red-faced, eyes wild. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "I want to speak with the district. Now." Torres stood calmly. "Mr. Reynolds, you're aware we've reviewed surveillance footage." "I don't care about your footage," Reynolds snapped. "You're going to believe this overachieving little girl over me? After all my years here?" Torres didn't flinch. "I'm not believing her. I'm believing the evidence." Reynolds scoffed. "I have a right to question irregular scores. That's what good teachers do. It's called academic integrity." Lena stood up then. She wasn't shaking anymore. Her voice was steady. "You didn't question me because of the score. You questioned me because you never thought I belonged in your top ranks." Reynolds turned on her. "Watch it." But Lena didn't blink. "I don't need you to believe me. I just need the truth to be seen." Torres nodded toward the hallway. "Mr. Reynolds, effective immediately, you are suspended pending further investigation. You'll collect your personal items and leave the premises." "You can't be serious," Reynolds shouted. "This is my career." Torres didn't raise his voice. "And this is your responsibility." Security personnel appeared at the door. Reynolds looked at them, then at Torres, then back at Lena. He was waiting for someone to speak up, to back him, to rescue his crumbling authority. No one did. He walked out, shaking with rage. Torres looked back at Lena. "We've also reached out to an academic scholarship program. They're reviewing your performance." Lena's mouth opened slightly. "A scholarship? You've shown not just academic strength," Torres said, "but character. And people are starting to notice." Lena nodded slowly. For the first time since this started, she felt like she could breathe. She hadn't needed to yell. She hadn't needed to fight dirty. The truth, finally, had done its job. By the time lunch rolled around the next day, Lena's name was everywhere. What started as whispers in the hallway had turned into full-on chatter across every group chat, lunch table, and social media feed at Lincoln High. A screenshot of the classroom footage, Mr. Reynolds glaring at her paper, The caption, "There's no way she's that smart," had gone viral in their school community. Someone started a hashtag Justice for Lena. Within hours, it had become the top trend on the student body's Instagram story chain. People who had barely spoken to her were reposting clips, adding their own captions. "I always knew she was the smartest in the room," or "This is why we need more cameras in classrooms." Others began to chime in with their own stories, small injustices they'd shrugged off at the time, but now realized were part of a larger pattern. A junior said Reynolds once assumed she plagiarized her essay because it was too advanced. A sophomore boy remembered being dismissed mid-sentence in front of the class. Suddenly, Lena's story wasn't just hers. It had cracked something open. Back in the teacher's lounge, Miss Kaplan, the physics teacher, sat at her desk staring at the emails flooding her inbox. She had taught Lena in sophomore year and remembered how quietly brilliant she was. Never loud, never showy, just focused. She didn't say a word to anyone, but that afternoon she opened her private recommendation portal and submitted Lena's name to a National STEM Scholarship Foundation. She attached grades, her own glowing review, and a link to the video evidence. She didn't ask for permission. She just hit send. That Friday, Principal Torres called for an all-school assembly. Students filed into the auditorium, buzzing with energy. The air was heavy with expectation. Teachers lined the back wall. Lena sat with her class, hands in her lap, trying not to shake. The stage lights came up, and Torres stepped to the microphone. He didn't waste time. "What happened in our school this week was unacceptable," he said flatly. Not just because a teacher was biased, but because the culture that allowed it to go unchecked, until it boiled over, exists here, in our halls, in our silence. You could feel the shift in the room. It wasn't just about one teacher anymore. Torres continued, "We've begun a review of all reported classroom incidents over the last 2 years. We are listening. We are investigating. And we are changing." Then he turned to where Lena Saturday. "Lena Nguyen, would you please join me on stage?" For a second, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she stood and walked forward. Students clapped. First a few, then the whole auditorium. Not everyone was cheering, but the ones who mattered were. Lena stood beside Torres as he turned to the mic again. "What this student did took courage," he said. "And for that, we owe her an apology." The words hung in the air. "On behalf of this school," he said clearly, "I apologize for the way you were treated, for the way your hard work was questioned, and for the silence of those who should have stood beside you sooner." Lena didn't speak. She didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. That evening, her inbox was full again. But this time, it wasn't just students. Reporters, scholarship committees, a rep from the National STEM Scholars Program. She read the email 3 times just to make sure it was real. They'd seen the story. They wanted to speak with her. She had been nominated quietly, anonymously by one of her past teachers. And they were impressed. The truth had traveled faster than the lie. And now, the spotlight was finally somewhere it belonged. A week later, the auditorium was filled again, only this time, the mood was different. There was no tension, no guessing about what was coming. Everyone knew why they were there. On the stage, a large banner read, "Honoring Excellence, Scholarship Recognition Ceremony." Principal Torres stood at the podium, flipping through his notes, but his voice was confident, proud. "Today, we celebrate achievement, not just academic brilliance, but character, resilience, and the kind of leadership that moves an entire school forward," he said. "It's my honor to share that Lena Nguyen has been awarded a full-ride scholarship to Weston Institute of Technology, one of the most competitive STEM universities in the country." The applause was immediate and loud. Some students stood. A few whistled. Lena walked slowly to the stage, her face composed, but her hands clenched so tight she could barely feel her fingers. She accepted the envelope and the mic with a nod. She didn't give a speech, just a quiet, "Thank you for seeing me," before stepping back and letting the applause return. But even that was enough. Her words hit because they were honest. They didn't try to inspire. They just told the truth. In the crowd, Logan Evans sat with his arms folded, staring at the floor. After the assembly ended and students filtered out, he stayed behind. Lena was speaking with a few teachers when he walked over, alone. "Hey," he said. She looked up. "Listen, I owe you an apology." He didn't rush the words. "I said some things that were wrong. I didn't believe you. I didn't even try to. And that's on me." For a second, she said nothing. Then, Quietly, she nodded. Thank you. That was it. No big drama. No perfect ending. Just accountability raw and overdue. Later that week, Principal Torres sent out an official school-wide email. It detailed a new policy overhaul. Every teacher would undergo updated bias and inclusion training. All tests scoring above a certain percentile would now go through blind review. A new student-teacher council was being created to give students a voice in curriculum feedback and classroom dynamics. These weren't just PR moves. They were structural, permanent. A clear message. What happened to Lena wasn't going to happen again. That Friday, in a staff meeting, Ms. Kaplan spoke up. "We can't just teach students how to succeed," she said. "We have to teach ourselves how not to stand in the way when they do." Around the room, a few teachers nodded. Some didn't. Change never hits everyone at once. But the momentum had started. Lena didn't go back to being invisible. She didn't become a hero, either. She became something else entirely, recognized. Not just for what she'd endured, but for what she had proven through it. That talent doesn't come with a specific zip code. That brilliance doesn't ask for permission. And that the truth, no matter how long it's ignored, doesn't just survive. It shines. The gym was packed wall to wall, the final school assembly of the year. Students from every grade sat on the bleachers, some chatting, others scrolling their phones, but all of them waiting for the moment they knew was coming. Lena stood just off stage, holding a folded piece of paper. She hadn't planned to say anything big, hadn't wanted to turn this into a spectacle. But now, standing there, knowing what this year had meant not just for her, but for so many others, she realized silence wasn't an option. Principal Torres introduced her with a few simple words, then stepped aside. Lena walked to the center of the stage. The applause came quickly, but she didn't speak until it faded. "I'm not here today because I'm special," she began, voice calm. "I'm here because I was told I wasn't." The room quieted. No one is born less capable. We're just born into systems that tell some of us we are. That treat our achievements like mistakes. That rewards silence and punish doubt when it comes from the wrong face. She glanced across the crowd, locking eyes with no one and everyone. You don't need to be perfect to deserve respect. You don't need to come from the right family to be smart. And you definitely don't need anyone's permission to be great. You just need to keep going, even when they say you can't. She paused, then added, "I didn't win anything. I earned it. Like so many students here who work twice as hard for half the recognition. But things are changing. And they should. Because no one should have to prove their worth just to be seen." Her final words hit clean. No one is born less than. We're just born underestimated. The crowd was still for a breath. Then the clapping started. It wasn't polite applause. It was real. Teachers stood. Students stood. The gym filled with the sound of something deeper than approval, understanding. Lena stepped back. She didn't smile big. She didn't cry. She just nodded once and walked off stage. Later that afternoon, she stood alone in the main hallway, staring up at the newly installed honor wall. Her name was there, carved into the plaque beneath the words, "Academic Courage." Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the metal and bouncing a warm glow across her face. The building was quiet. No crowd. No noise. Just the proof that she had always been enough, and now the world had to see it. Because the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. If this story moved you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful true stories. And remember, your voice matters. Hit the like button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment like this.